In the spring of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib was searching for a lost goat in the cliffs above the Dead Sea. The landscape was barren, the heat was brutal, and the caves that pocked the limestone cliffs had been empty for nearly 2,000 years. He threw a rock into one of those caves, hoping to startle the goat out. What he heard instead was the sound of something shattering. He climbed into the cave, and what he found inside would permanently change the fields of biblical studies, archaeology, and ancient history. What he found would confirm things that skeptics had spent centuries doubting. What he found would force scholars to rewrite their assumptions about the Bible, about Judaism, about the world in which Jesus walked and taught. What he found were clay jars, sealed, ancient, and inside those jars, scrolls, wrapped in linen, preserved for 2,000 years by the dry desert air of the Judean wilderness. Muhammad Ed-Dib had no idea what he was holding. He sold them to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem for a handful of dollars. And with that transaction, one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in the history of the world entered the modern era almost completely by accident. We are talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And today we are going through everything: what they are, where they came from, what they contain, what they proved, what they challenged, and why. 75 years after that shepherd threw his rock, they still matter profoundly to every person who reads the Bible. Let us start with the basics. Between 1947 and 1956, 11 caves in the Qumran region near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea were systematically excavated. From those 11 caves, archaeologists recovered approximately 981 different manuscripts, some nearly complete, many in thousands of tiny fragments, representing over 900 individual texts. They are written primarily in Hebrew, with significant portions in Aramaic and some in Greek. The materials used were animal skin parchment and papyrus. The oldest of them date to the 3rd century BC. The most recent date to approximately 68 AD, the year the Roman army under Vespasian swept through the region, destroying the Jewish settlement at Qumran. The collection represents the largest and oldest repository of Jewish manuscripts ever found. Nothing in the history of biblical archaeology comes close. Now, who put them there? The prevailing scholarly consensus, though not without debate, is that the scrolls were the library of a Jewish sect called the Essenes. The Essenes are mentioned by Josephus, by Philo of Alexandria, and by the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, all of whom describe them as a separatist group who withdrew from mainstream Jewish society, lived communally, practiced ritual purity obsessively, rejected the Jerusalem temple establishment as corrupt, and were deeply apocalyptic in their expectations. They were waiting for the end of the age. They believed themselves to be the true remnant of Israel, preserving authentic faith in a generation of apostasy. The settlement at Qumran, a complex of buildings whose ruins can still be visited today, appears to have been their headquarters. When the Romans began their military campaign through Judea in 68 AD, the Essenes hid their library in the caves above their settlement. They expected to come back for it. They never did. The scrolls sat in those caves, in their sealed clay jars, for nearly 2,000 years, until a lost goat and a thrown rock changed everything. Now, what do the scrolls actually contain? The collection divides into two broad categories. The first category is biblical manuscripts. The second is non-biblical texts, sectarian documents, commentaries, and other literature important to the Qumran community. Let us start with the biblical manuscripts, because this is where the impact on Christian faith is most direct and most profound. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the oldest complete manuscript of the Hebrew Old Testament in existence was the Leningrad Codex, dated to approximately 1008 AD. The Aleppo Codex, slightly older, dated to around 920 AD. These were the manuscripts that Hebrew scholars used to establish the text of the Old Testament, and they were separated from the original writings of the Old Testament prophets by roughly 1,000 years. For centuries, skeptics had raised a reasonable question. 1,000 years of copying by human hands in a world before the printing press. How do we know the text had not been significantly altered? How do we know what we read in our Bibles today is what Isaiah actually wrote, or what the Psalms originally said? The Dead Sea Scrolls answered that question definitively. Among the manuscripts recovered from Cave 1 was a complete scroll of the book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters, written on 17 sheets of leather sewn together, totaling 24 feet in length. It is called the Great Isaiah Scroll. It dates to approximately 125 BC. That means it is over 1,000 years older than any previously known manuscript of Isaiah. When scholars compared the Great Isaiah Scroll to the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text that forms the basis of our modern Old Testament translations, they found that the two texts were, in the words of Old Testament scholar Gleason Archer, word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. The remaining 5% consisted of obvious slips of the pen, spelling variations, and minor differences of no theological significance whatsoever. 1,000 years of hand copying, across dozens of generations of scribes, and the text had been preserved with extraordinary faithfulness. This was not a small discovery. This was a seismic confirmation of what Christians had long believed by faith, that God had superintended the preservation of His Word across centuries of human history. The skeptics who had argued that the Old Testament text was hopelessly corrupted were silenced not by theological argument, but by archaeology. In addition to Isaiah, fragments of every book of the Old Testament were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, with one exception: the Book of Esther. Every single book of the Hebrew canon, Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, the Psalms, the Prophets, all of them represented in the caves of Qumran. The Psalms were the most extensively represented, with fragments from 39 of the 150 Psalms. Deuteronomy was the second most common. Isaiah was the third. The fact that these were the three most copied books at Qumran is itself significant. Deuteronomy and Isaiah are together the most quoted books in the New Testament. The community at Qumran, 2 centuries before Christ, was intensely focused on the same text that the early Christians would later find most theologically central. But the biblical manuscripts are only part of the story. The non-biblical texts found at Qumran are equally extraordinary, and in some ways even more illuminating. Among the most important is the Community Rule, sometimes called the Manual of Discipline. This is essentially the rulebook of the Qumran community. It describes their initiation procedures, their communal meals, their theology of good and evil, their expectations about the end of the age. It reveals a community that practiced baptismal washings for purification, shared meals together in a formal, ritualized way, and organized themselves under a council of 12, the same number as the tribes of Israel and the apostles of Jesus. The parallels between the Qumran community and the early Christian community are striking enough that some scholars have proposed a direct connection. John the Baptist, who ministered in the wilderness near the Dead Sea, baptized in the Jordan River, lived an ascetic life, and preached repentance and the coming judgment, fits several of the Essene characteristics so closely that many historians believe he may have spent time with the Qumran community before beginning his public ministry. The Bible does not tell us what John did between his birth and his appearance in the wilderness. The Dead Sea Scrolls help fill in the world he was living in. Among the other non-biblical texts, the War Scroll describes an eschatological battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, an apocalyptic conflict between the righteous and the wicked at the end of the age. The imagery is strikingly similar to the language of spiritual warfare found in Paul's letters and in the book of Revelation. The Thanksgiving hymns, called the Hodayot, are a collection of poetic prayers of gratitude, several of which bear remarkable similarity in structure and language to the Psalms. Some scholars believe they were written by the teacher of righteousness, the founding figure of the Qumran community, whose identity remains unknown but whose influence on the sect was comparable to what Moses was for Israel. The Temple Scroll, the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls at nearly 28 feet, describes an idealized temple that God would one day build, with measurements and regulations far more elaborate than anything in the Torah. It presents itself almost as a sixth book of Moses, written in the first person as if God himself is speaking. And then, the Copper Scroll. Found in Cave 3, the Copper Scroll is unlike anything else in the collection. While most of the scrolls are written on leather or papyrus, this one is engraved on thin sheets of copper. And its content is not theological. It is practical. It is a list, a detailed, specific list, of 64 locations where vast quantities of treasure are buried. Gold, silver, sacred vessels. The total amounts, if taken at face value, are staggering. Some estimates place the described treasure at over $1 billion in modern value. Scholars debate whether the Copper Scroll describes real buried treasure from the Jerusalem Temple, perhaps hidden before the Roman destruction of 70 AD, or whether it is a literary composition describing an idealized or mythological treasure. No one has ever found the treasure. The locations described, while geographically specific enough to suggest real places, have not been definitively identified. The Copper Scroll remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the entire Dead Sea collection. Now, here is where we must address the most theologically important dimension of all of this. The Dead Sea Scrolls place us, for the first time in modern history, directly inside the Jewish world of the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. They give us the actual texts that were being read, studied, copied, and debated in the generation immediately before Jesus was born and in the generation in which he lived. And what they reveal is that the world Jesus entered was saturated with messianic expectation. The Qumran texts describe not one but two messianic figures, a priestly Messiah from the line of Aaron and a royal Messiah from the line of David. The community was waiting for both. They expected the end of the age. They expected a final judgment. They expected the restoration of Israel and the defeat of its enemies. They were, in the deepest sense, a community living in anticipation. And into that world of anticipation, Jesus came. The scrolls do not mention Jesus. They do not mention John the Baptist by name. They do not reference early Christianity. They predate the public ministry of Jesus and were hidden before the church began to spread. This is important to understand, because some popular writers have made wildly exaggerated claims about secret Christian content in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those claims do not hold up to scholarly examination. What the scrolls do, which is actually more valuable than any direct mention could be, is show us the soil in which Jesus planted his seeds. They show us the categories of thought, the expectations, the language, the urgency, the hunger for God that characterized Judaism in the period immediately surrounding the life of Christ. When Jesus stood up in the synagogue in Nazareth and read from Isaiah 61, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor," and then said, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." He was speaking into a world the Dead Sea Scrolls help us understand with a depth we simply could not have had before 1947. The scrolls also have profound implications for the text of the New Testament, though indirectly. The Gospel of John has long been noted for its distinctive vocabulary: light versus darkness, truth versus falsehood, the spirit of truth, the children of light. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, critical scholars argued that this vocabulary was evidence that John was written late, perhaps in the 2nd century, under heavy influence from Greek philosophy, specifically Gnosticism. They argued it was too theologically developed to be an eyewitness account from the 1st century. The Dead Sea Scrolls dismantled that argument completely. The same vocabulary, light and darkness, truth and falsehood, the spirit of truth, the sons of light, appears extensively in the Qumran texts, written 2 centuries before Christ, in a thoroughly Jewish context with no Greek philosophical influence whatsoever. The theological language of John's Gospel was not borrowed from Greek philosophy. It was native to Palestinian Judaism. The critics had been wrong, and the scrolls proved it. John Allegro, one of the original international team of scholars assigned to study the scrolls, and one of the more controversial figures in Dead Sea Scroll scholarship, said of this discovery, "The Dead Sea Scrolls have shown that many of the ideas which were thought to be distinctively Christian or to derive from Greek philosophy were in fact native to Jewish thought centuries before Christ." The scrolls also shed extraordinary light on the process of Jewish biblical interpretation in the period before Jesus. Among the texts found at Qumran are documents called Pesharim, commentaries on the biblical prophets in which the ancient prophecies are interpreted as being fulfilled in the present life of the Qumran community. The method of interpretation, taking an ancient text and saying, "This is what is happening now," is exactly the same method we see Jesus and the apostles using throughout the New Testament. When Peter stands up on the day of Pentecost and quotes Joel chapter 2, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. "In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people." He is using a Pesher method of interpretation. When Matthew quotes Isaiah 7 verse 14 and says, All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. Same method. The Dead Sea Scrolls show us that this was not a novel Christian innovation. It was a deeply established Jewish hermeneutical practice. What is new in the New Testament is not the method, it is the answer. The Qumran community interpreted the prophets as pointing to their own community, their own teacher of righteousness, their own coming battle. The apostles interpreted the same prophets as pointing to Jesus of Nazareth, his life, his death, his resurrection, his coming again. Same method, different and world-altering conclusion. Now, what about the fragments that some have claimed are controversial? What about the suggestions that the scrolls contain secret gospels, hidden truths about Jesus, or information that the church suppressed? These claims need to be addressed honestly, because they circulate widely in popular culture. The reality is this: the Dead Sea Scrolls contain no secret gospels. They contain no references to Jesus as a human teacher whose identity the church later exaggerated into divinity. They contain no evidence of a suppressed Christianity, no alternative narratives of the resurrection, no hidden teachings of any apostle. These claims, which have been made in popular books and documentaries for decades, are not supported by the texts themselves. The initial secrecy surrounding access to the scrolls, a small team of scholars controlled access for decades, and the full publication of all the texts was not complete until the 1990s, did create an environment in which conspiracy theories flourished. Some scholars behaved possessively and delayed publication for reasons that were more academic than conspiratorial. But once the texts were fully published and made available to the entire scholarly community, and ultimately to the general public, the conspiracy theories collapsed under the weight of the actual evidence. What the scrolls contain is extraordinary enough without embellishment. They do not need secret gospels to be significant. Their significance is their authenticity, their antiquity, and their confirmation. They confirm that the Old Testament text has been faithfully preserved across 2 millennia of hand copying. They confirm that the theological language and messianic expectations of the New Testament are rooted in authentic first-century Judaism, not in later Hellenistic invention. They give us an unprecedented window into the world in which John the Baptist preached, in which Jesus walked, in which the apostles first proclaimed the resurrection. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that the God who inspired the scriptures is also the God who preserved them. 2,000 years in a cave, sealed in clay jars, in a desert so arid that leather and papyrus survived intact across 20 centuries of human history. That the scrolls were discovered at all, by an accidental rock throw, by a lost goat, by a teenager who was looking for an animal and found ancient treasure, is the kind of providential irony that fills the pages of the Bible itself. God has never been anxious about the preservation of His Word. He has never needed human institutions to protect what He intended to keep. The scrolls sat in those caves through the rise and fall of Rome, through the Crusades, through the Ottoman Empire, through 2 world wars, and then a teenager threw a rock, and everything changed. The great Isaiah scroll, written 125 years before Jesus was born, found 1,947 years after He walked the earth, still says exactly what it said when the scribe first pressed his pen to the leather. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on His shoulders. And He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. 2,000 years in a cave. And the word of God did not change by a single letter. That is what the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered. And that is why it matters.